Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Good Measure. My name is David and I'll be your host today. Today we have Alex Blanton, Principal Program Manager at Microsoft. He's here today with us to talk about AI and machine learning and management at Microsoft. Alex, thank you for being here with us today. Do you mind quickly introducing yourself to those in the audience who may not be familiar with you and your work?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Nice to talk with you today. I'm a program manager at Microsoft. A program manager at Microsoft does not necessarily manage people. I manage programs. I work in the office of the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer. So our office in general guides the technical strategy of the company. The particular area I work in is technical communities, internal technical communities. So I have like four main things that I work on. One is our internal AI and machine learning community. So that's about 10,000 people from across the company who are interested in practicing ML. Many of them are data scientists, but not all of them, and anyone is welcome. And so obviously I don't manage all those people, but I manage the community itself. We have a conference that we do twice a year associated with the community, the Machine Learning, AI, and Data Science Conference. So I'm the lead organizer of that. And then I work with our technical leader community. That's Microsoft's technical fellows, distinguished engineers, and distinguished scientists. That's the top technical talent at the company. And that's a much smaller community, about 150 people. And we do work with them, provide them ways to connect with one another. And then I work on some early stage community efforts. So projects that might need a community later on in their life, I'll consult with them early.
And as I saw in your LinkedIn profile, you run like 50 to 60 events per year. And among those, what kind of events are the most engaging for very like highly intelligent individuals and those who are very talented that work at Microsoft?
We do all kinds of different events. One thing I try to do is keep a lot of variety. So there's different kinds of topics, different kinds of approaches. So certainly sessions on our own technologies are important. So we'll bring members of the product team to talk to our field folks who are working with customers. We'll do case study sessions. We did one earlier today on a nuclear energy trading application done up in Canada where the data scientists presented learnings and insights. People will talk about technical innovations that they're making with our own products and on our own products. We'll talk about what it's like to be a data scientist, how to become one. Really, the key is trying to keep it fresh and new over time.
Yeah. And so I guess following up to that, as someone who has been observing this community for a long time, what trends have you observed within this sort of group of developers, and sort of how can these trends be understood in a way through the public lens, so we have a sort of better understanding of how these companies work internally?
I think one thing you'll see is this trend towards the democratization of AI. So these large companies trying to make it possible for smaller companies or individuals to use our platforms to do machine learning and AI more efficiently. So for instance, you have these things called cognitive services. That's basically pre-built models to address things like translation or object detection or anomaly detection so that you don't have to build that model yourself. You can just take that model and use it in your products. And so there's people building that, and we call that like pre-built AI. A couple other areas that we focus a lot on, I can't speak for other companies, but is the idea of interpretability in your machine learning models. The machine's going to tell you something or make a decision, and in some contexts you might not care why. Who really cares why it's recommending another book or another piece of music based on a previous purchase, like what signal it's picking up? It's not that important. But in domains like healthcare or military domain or autonomous vehicles, like those are places where there's probably going to be a need to understand why the machine is making the decisions it is. We also focus a lot on responsible uses of AI. So responsible AI, you may have seen sort of a rollout and then a retraction of a lot of facial recognition software that then was used in ways that society as itself didn't really seem ready for. And so there's not a lot of regulation in this space right now. So
Yeah.
companies need to be out ahead of where the laws are in some cases, and looking at the ethics and self-regulating. So we focus a lot on that at Microsoft.
Yeah. And so I think while reading your blog a while back, one of my favorite quotes that I read was that while a well-functioning platform is important, a community is at its heart the people. And so how has the AI and ML community stayed together and support each other during tough times during the COVID period at Microsoft?
I think the community has been very resilient during COVID. Part of that is that we're a worldwide community to begin with. And so while we did some things in person, a lot of what we did was virtual already. So we kind of doubled down on that. Some of the things like the conference obviously went entirely virtual. But I would say like the impact of the pandemic on the community specifically was not all that great. Obviously, there's a ton going on in the world that's affecting people personally. I think more of the impact is on teams, so if you're used to going to work and having your teammates on the same corridor and that kind of thing, that's where teams have had to be imaginative in how they use the digital technologies to retain connection, especially as new people get hired and they don't have a chance to meet their managers in person or any of their coworkers. So we do things like earlier today, we did an AMA with our group leader, even though she's very accessible anyway, but just by the team creating a channel and structure to submit questions on any topic and getting 30 minutes of her dedicated time, it allows folks sort of in that kind of interaction where you might stop by her office to ask the question, but you can't do that. So you have to like kind of organize that a bit more than in normal times.
And I guess to like speak on the same lines of that, have teams at Microsoft begun to reintegrate into an in-person working environment? And if so, like what benefits do you think working in person brings to a community and the work culture?
Yeah, so we're the different campuses are on these stages from 1 to 6, and at stage 6, everything's back to normal. In Redmond, Washington, where I work, we're in stage 5, so that means you can go into work if you want, but you don't have to. And some people are. I think most people still aren't. I'm generally not going into the office. It sort of goes back to my earlier point that the connections you get by those. It's not so much the structured connections, because meetings, they have an agenda, they have outcomes, they have objectives. It's a lot more the casual type of stuff, like running into people in the kitchen, brainstorming with people casually, realizing you need a quick answer from someone and waiting till they walk by your office. Those are the things that we're lacking. There's been some interesting research on this, actually, that our company and other people have done. It turns out like a lot of people who are either senior or well-established with long tenures at the company are much more comfortable with the online format because they already have their networks of contacts and relationships. And if they're high up in the org, they have no trouble getting people's attention through email or meeting invites. But for folks who are newer in their career or new to the company or both, has been very challenging because you just don't have the chance to even establish your identity as a Microsoft employee. Like we have some people who've never been to the Microsoft campus. And so they say, I'm not even sure I feel like an employee yet until I get a chance to sit in an office, go to the cafeteria. So those are the things that we're lacking, that when we go back in person, I think there'll be this flood of folks connecting, and I'm not sure exactly what will happen. It'll be really interesting.
And so I want to really quickly retrace back to the point. And you said that the Microsoft Machine Learning, AI, and Data Science Conference was really recent. And although it was a private conference, were there any important and big lessons that you think would translate well for any sort of public data scientists, developers, anybody who's really interested in this community that you feel willing to share about?
Well, certainly all of the individual sessions have their own specific learning objectives. But I think moving up a level, it's very clear that in this field of AI and ML and data science, it's moving very quickly and technology is changing very rapidly. And so I think that the biggest lesson for someone who wants to get in is that you have to be prepared to be a continual learner. Like obviously you need to learn the technology, but you're going to have to maybe relearn it in a year or two. I was talking to someone who said he was teaching some courses and he said, the stuff I'm teaching now didn't exist 18 months ago, and it might not exist 18 months from now. And I'm learning it as I'm teaching it. So I think that mentality is really important to
Yeah.
take. Yeah.
And so speaking about mentality, I guess like as someone who has actually worked at Microsoft for a number of years and in 7 different roles, and how has that sort of helped you understand the company's work culture, and how has that actually helped you as a program manager decide on what programs to bring and how to run programs at Microsoft?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I I think if you're lucky enough to be able to define what you're doing, you're going to want to really understand what your group's objective is and tie your particular efforts to that. Because if there's a misalignment there, no matter how interesting the work you're doing, you're going to lack the sponsorship and support from the team and from the management to get it done. I think at a large company like Microsoft, having a good manager, someone you interact well with, who understands you and what you want to do and can help you with that mapping is just so important. Like I know people who, love the work, but didn't have a good manager, didn't have a good relationship with the manager, and that wasn't a good situation.
Yeah.
Sort of the saying is like that, the most important thing is the good manager, and then sort of the work and will follow from that. So
Yeah.
I think that's important. And when I change jobs, I pay a lot of attention to who I'm going to work for. And yeah, I view the interviewing as much me discovering things about them as them about me. I think it's also really important that the group you work in has a clear idea of where it's going.
Mm-hmm.
I have worked in teams that didn't have that, and they floundered, because they didn't have that North Star they're going after. When the team understands what its mission is, then you can sort of put all your strength behind that. But if you don't know where the team is going, you're kind of not sure where to turn. I don't know if that gets at the kind of thing you wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
But
And so I guess on that same note, like with working in teams at Microsoft, like as someone who has worked in so many different teams, like what have been some of the hardest challenges you've had to overcome in terms of maybe working with a coworker or working on a massive project, and in what way was it hard to sort of find a solution or overcome it?
I think the hardest thing I did was also the most exciting in the end. It was about 7 years ago when I moved into the machine learning space, because the group I was in was suddenly dissolved as part of this broad reorganization. And a corporate vice president asked me to come into his group and really turn my attention to fostering a machine learning community within the company. Because at the time, most employees didn't really know anything about machine learning. I mean,
Yeah.
researchers did, but it really hadn't made its way into the product groups. And it was a very quick job transfer. So it was literally like I was talking to the CVP on a Tuesday night and I said, I'm ready. He said, well, show up here tomorrow. So I showed up. I didn't have an office. I worked in the lounge for the first 3 days. So I really had to define my own job. And so as part of that, the first 3 months were really balancing short-term wins or gains to help and opportunities for me to kind of find my footing, as well as thinking through what a longer term strategy would look like. And after 3 months, I did produce a strategy that I presented and to the leadership, and it was bought off on, and that really set sort of that kind of vision North Star that I mentioned before for the community that we're largely still tracking to. So I think having that as the goal allowed me to overcome a lot of other challenges. Like, why are you doing this? Why should I devote resources? Why should I devote budget? Because I could always come back to, here's the vision for this. This is how it maps to the company's success. So honestly, that was, showing up that Wednesday morning, sitting in a lounge, having no idea what my job was supposed to be, in an entirely new group. I did happen to know a couple of people on the floor, but really knowing no one, that was a big challenge. And but it was also really fun. And looking back on it later, I count myself very lucky I was able to go through that.
And so I guess speaking about learning, I guess there have been a ton of new technologies sort of coming out over the course of these past 2 years during the pandemic. And so What do you think have been like some of the biggest focuses for AI and ML and technology these days, especially with the coming up out of Web3 and the blockchain and all that?
Well, I don't really know a lot about Web3 and blockchain. You will, you'll probably know a lot more about that than me. But I think from the AI and ML space, there's obviously like a lot going on. There's applications in all kinds of fields,
Yeah.
but I think at a broader level, it's really important to think through whether artificial intelligence is replacing what humans do or augmenting them,
Hmm.
what humans do, and sort of relieving humans of the boring,
Yeah.
dangerous, mundane things and allowing us to do what we do great, which is to create and make inferences that go beyond the
Yeah.
data that we might have at hand. And so it's up to us as creators of the AI to
Yeah.
design it so that it's augmenting the human functions rather than kind of trying to uh, displace people doing work. So that's going to be true in all kinds of domains like healthcare and robotics and whatnot.
Yeah.
Uh, Sales, marketing, retail, transportation. But I think going up a level, that's sort of what pops to mind for me there.
Mhm. And so I guess just one last follow-up question, I guess. What would be some great resources for people to learn more about AI and ML as someone who's sort of gone through this process yourself?
Yeah, well, when I first started working in the space, I would literally take notes every day and look up terms on Wikipedia, regression, decision forest, because it's like a whole new vocabulary. A lot of our folks use the Coursera courses or Udacity courses.
Hmm.
Now there are academic programs in data science and machine learning. A few years ago,
Yeah.
there weren't. And I still think in the field, self-educating like that is really valuable. There's also Kaggle is a competition platform that Google
Yeah.
runs. A lot of people get experience using that. One very specific thing I can recommend is I have a former colleague named Brandon Rohrer, Rohrer. He worked at Microsoft and Facebook, and now he's at iRobot. And he has a YouTube channel. He doesn't have tons and tons of subscribers. He has like 70,000. He does a tremendous job of explaining both simple concepts and complex concepts. And so I always recommend him as someone that people should tune into if they're just getting started and want to kind of listen to an accessible, easy to understand teacher.
Well, thank you so much. Are there any things that you would like to shout out? Anything you'd like to say to the audience before we end?
Uh, no, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. It was really interesting to tune back into Hotchkiss after having been away so long and actually not even having visited the campus in so long.
All right. Well, thank you.